Welcome back to Billionaire Success Lessons. Today, we are telling the story of a man who did not build his fortune by chasing attention, showing off on stage, or riding a fashionable wave at the perfect moment. He built it in one of the hardest fields in the world. A field where failure is expansive, progress is slow, and the stakes are deeply human. He built it in pharmaceuticals. This is the story of Piaoyang. And what makes his journey so powerful is not only that he became a billionaire, it is the kind of road he walked to get there. A road built on discipline, science, patience, and the willingness to stay committed to a mission that most people would never have the endurance to carry for decades. This is not a story about quick money. It is not a story about hype. It is a story about building trust in one of the few industries where your product is measured not only by profit, but by whether it can actually change or save lives. That changes everything, because when you work in medicine, you are not simply building a business. You are stepping into a space where the world demands more from you. More rigor, more patience, more responsibility, more truth. And truth is where Piaoyang seems to have built his life. He was born in China's Jiangsu province in 1958. And public profiles say he stood out early as a strong student before studying at China Pharmaceutical University in Later, he stepped into leadership at Jiangsu Hengrui, a former state-owned drug maker, in 1990. When he was just 32 years old. That is where the first lesson begins. Great success does not always begin with a glamorous opportunity. Sometimes it begins with a difficult, responsibility, a struggling company, a slow-moving system, a field full of pressure, a mission that looks too hard for ordinary ambition. Many people spend their lives waiting for the perfect chance. But the truth is that the perfect chance often never comes. What comes instead is an imperfect situation, a difficult structure, or a heavy burden that other people would rather avoid. And sometimes the person willing to carry that burden becomes the one who changes everything. Piaoyang did not begin by launching a trendy startup in a field built for instant praise. He stepped into a former pharmaceutical company and had to help transform it into something better, stronger, more innovative, and more globally relevant. That is not easy work. That is slow work, demanding work, the kind of work where progress is won, molecule by molecule, trial by trial, year by year. Most people admire finished success, but finished success is almost always built out of unfinished years. Years when the business is still weak. Years when the market is still doubtful. Years when your effort is real, but the outside world cannot yet see what it will become. Those are the years that create the future. And Piaoyang stayed through those years. That is one of the most important lessons in this entire story. Patience is not passive. Patience is active loyalty to a meaningful goal. It is the decision to keep showing up, to keep learning, to keep building, to keep improving when the reward is still too far away to impress anyone. That is what makes patience so powerful. It is invisible at first, but over time, it becomes one of the strongest forces in the world. In pharmaceuticals, that kind of patience matters even more, because this is not an industry where you can bluff your way to durable success. You cannot talk your way past bad science. You cannot market your way out of weak research forever. You cannot fake clinical value in the long run. At some point, the world asks the hardest question of all. Does the medicine work? And that question humbles everyone. It strips away vanity. It strips away noise. It strips away shallow ambition. And it leaves only substance. That is why Sun Piaoyang's story deserves deep respect. Because anyone who builds a serious pharmaceutical company has chosen one of the most demanding roads a business leader can choose. A software founder can pivot quickly. A media founder can change formats quickly. A retailer can swap products quickly. But in pharma, the path is longer. The risks are higher. The timelines are slower. The evidence matters more. And mistakes cost far more than money. They cost trust. That is why this story carries so much weight. Sun Piaoyang seems to have understood early that building a lasting pharmaceutical business would require more than manufacturing all products. It would require innovation. It would require long-term scientific seriousness. It would require turning a company that once belonged to an older model of Chinese industry into something that could compete in a new era. And that kind of transformation is never simple. Because transformation means leaving behind what feels safe. It means rethinking the business before the business forces you to. It means investing in a future that is expensive long before it becomes profitable. That is hard for any leader. It is even harder in medicine. But that is exactly where long-term builders separate themselves from short-term operators. A short-term operator asks, "How do I protect the business this year?" A long-term builder asks, "How do I make this business matter 10 years from now?" That second question is harder, but it is the question that creates empires. Hengrui's 2025 annual report said the company's annual revenue reached RMB 31.629 billion, up 13.0% year-over-year. Revenue from innovative drug sales reached RMB 16.342 billion, up 26.1%. And total R&D investment reached RMB 8.724 billion. The same report says the company obtained approvals for 7 Class 1 innovative drugs in 2025. Those numbers are not just impressive. They are revealing, because they show what kind of company Hengrui has become under long-term leadership. Not merely a manufacturer, not merely a seller of old formulas, but an innovation-driven pharmaceutical company trying to build value through research, drug development, and scientific depth. That shift matters. It tells us that Sun Piaoyang did not only preserve a company. He helped reimagine it. And that is one of the highest forms of leadership. Anyone can inherit a structure. Far fewer can turn it into something more powerful than it was before. That is where true builders live. When you think about leadership, it is easy to romanticize the bold moment. The takeover, the early decisions, the big turning point. But in reality, leadership is usually not made in one dramatic moment. It is made in repeated judgment, repeated decisions, repeated sacrifices, repeated refusals to settle for easy answers, and in Sun Piaoyang's world, that meant staying close to science, staying close to pipelines, staying close to where medicine was going, not just where it had already been. That kind of thinking becomes especially important when an industry changes, and the pharmaceutical industry has changed a lot. Competition intensifies, regulation shifts, global partnerships matter more, generic products face pricing pressure, innovation becomes more expansive. The bar for relevance keeps rising. A company that cannot evolve eventually gets left behind. That is why the middle of a success story matters so much. The beginning gets attention, the ending gets applause, but the middle is where a business either matures or breaks. And the middle is rarely glamorous. The middle is where you spend money before the market rewards you. The middle is where you bet on research before the data is final. The middle is where you endure criticism, delays, uncertainty, and the emotional fatigue of trying to build something that the future will understand better than the present does. That is exactly why so few people make it through. But Sun Piaoyang did. And that may be the clearest lesson this life offers. Do you not only admire ambition, admire and ambition begins the journey. Endurance finishes it. A lot of people know how to start strongly. Far fewer know how to keep going when progress becomes technical, slow, and painful. That is what makes durable success so rare. Hengrui's 2025 report also said licensing revenue rose to RMB 3.392 billion, and the company's official English release said 2025 brought accelerated global expansion, including 5 overseas business development transactions, highlighted by a strategic collaboration with Reuters later reported that GSK's 2025 deal with Hengrui could reach up to $12 billion in milestone payments if all options and targets were achieved. That tells us something else important. Sun Piaoyang was not only building for domestic survival, he was building for global relevance. And that is a very different level of thinking. Because global relevance requires more than local strength. It requires standards. It requires credibility. It requires innovation serious enough that other major companies want access to what you are building. That is a sign of industrial maturity. And it reflects one of the deepest patterns in this story. Serious work attracts serious partner. When a company becomes strong enough, the world begins to treat it differently. Not because of slogans, not because of branding, but because the substance is too real to ignore. That is one of the most satisfying parts of any success story. The moment when years of invisible effort start becoming visible in the form of recognition, scale, and opportunity. But even then, the work does not get easier. In fact, success often creates a new kind of pressure. Now the question is no longer, can you survive? Now the question becomes, can you stay relevant? Can you keep innovating? Can you justify the expectations your success has created? That is hard. And it is especially hard in pharmaceuticals, where one breakthrough does not guarantee the next one. And where old success can quickly become yesterday's story if the pipeline weakens. Reuters reported in March 2026 that Hengrui's innovative drug sales had climbed in 2025, while generic drug revenue and the net profit for full year 2025 rose 21.69% to RMB 7.71 billion. That snapshot captures both sides of reality at once. Innovation is rising, but pressure on older parts of the business remains real. That is a powerful reminder. A great business is not built by escaping difficulty. It is built by learning how to evolve through difficulty. And that is exactly what makes Sun Piaoyang's story feel substantial. It is not a story of luck. It is not a story of one perfect year. It is not a story of hype. It is a story of long-term seriousness in one of the toughest industries in the world. There is something deeply human in that. Because underneath the corporate reports, the billionaire rankings, and the large numbers, this story is really about a man who gave decades of his life to mastering a hard mission. That mission was not always glamorous, not always smooth, not always easy to explain in one sentence. But it mattered. And meaning matters more than style in the long run. A lot of people today are tempted by fast paths, fast attention, fast applause, fast results. But many of the most powerful lives in the world are built in the opposite direction. Slowly, quietly, seriously, painfully, methodically. That kind of success may look less exciting from the outside at first, but it tends to be much harder to destroy. That is the kind of strength Sun Piaoyang's journey represents. Here on Billionaire Success Lessons, that matters because stories like his bring us back to what real achievement actually looks like. It looks like showing up year after year. It looks like building through uncertainty. It looks like taking one difficult field more seriously than almost anyone else is willing to take it. It looks like investing in things that the crowd may not fully understand yet. It looks like holding your nerve while the world keeps moving and the pressure keeps rising. That is how a former state-owned drug maker becomes a modern pharmaceutical giant. That is how a difficult responsibility becomes a life-defining mission. That is how a leader becomes more than just rich. He becomes consequential, and consequential success is different from fashionable success. fashionable success gets noticed. Consequently, success changes the structure of the world around it. Medicine belongs to that second category. Because when a pharmaceutical company grows stronger, it does not only create wealth, it creates options. It creates treatment possibilities. It creates scientific progress. It creates the possibility that pain, illness, and uncertainty might be met with something better than what existed before. That is not a small thing. That is why this story feels heavier than many others. And that is why Sun Piaoyang's path deserves to be told with respect. For anyone listening right now who feels discouraged because your field is hard, slow, or not especially glamorous, there is a message here worth holding tightly. You do not need an easy industry to build a meaningful life. You do not need fast results to be on the right path. You do not need loud attention to create deep value. You do not need your early chapters to look spectacular. What you need is the willingness to stay with the hard thing long enough for your effort to compound. That is how small beginnings become large outcomes. That is how responsibility becomes influence. That is how seriousness becomes power. Sun Piaoyang's life proves that. He stepped into a difficult company. He stayed inside a demanding industry. He helped drive it toward innovation. He endured the long middle that breaks many people. And he stayed serious enough for decades that eventually the world had to take notice. So when you think about Sun Piaoyang, do not just think about billionaire lists. Think about the young student from Jiangsu. Think about the future pharmaceutical leader studying seriously and think about the 32-year-old stepping into his former state-owned company in 1990 and choosing not to run from the burden. Think about the years when innovation was expensive and slow. Think about the discipline required to keep building R&D strength when easier paths may have looked more attractive. Think about the chairman whose company generated RMB 31.629 billion in revenue in 2025, with innovative drug sales of RMB 16.342 billion and R&D investment of RMB 8.724 billion, because he spent decades taking the hard path seriously. That is the story of Sun Piaoyang. Not just a story of billions. A story of science. A story of patience. A story of pressure. A story of long-term vision. And a story of proving that some of the most powerful people in the world are the ones willing to spend their lives mastering the difficult work that everybody else depends on.